Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Comay with the U2 Conference Committee. I'm happy to be here to host this panel titled Changing Direction Rather Than Changing Oneself. Changing Direction Rather Than Changing Oneself as a title intentionally mixes up two lines from U2's O Berlin. And it's meant to discuss Achtung Baby in a number of different contexts. And joining me today are two esteemed individuals who I'm honored to introduce. Elysa Gardner, previously USA Today's music and theater critic, currently covers cabaret for the New York Times and writes about the arts for various publications, including Town & Country, Time Out New York, and Broadway Direct, where she hosts the podcast Stage Door Sessions. Elysa is also a critic for the New York Stage Review and has been a contributor to the New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, the Village Voice, the Rolling Stone, VH1, NPR. She's on the nominating committee for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and has twice served on the Pulitzer Prize jury for drama, most recently as its chair. She wrote the introduction to the book U2, The Rolling Stone Files, and is the author of an upcoming book about the musical Pippin, set to be published by Applause in October 2022. Elysa also wrote the review of Achtung Baby that was published in Rolling Stone in October 1991. Welcome, Elysa.
Thank you. I was 24, I should point out. That still dates me quite a bit. But...
Based in San Francisco, Matt Nathanson has evolved into one of the most applauded songwriters and engaging performers in the music scene today. His 2007 album, Some Mad Hope, yielded his breakthrough multi-platinum hit, Come On Get Higher. His 2013 release, Last of the Great Pretenders, debuted at number 16 on Billboard's Top 200, while hitting number 1 on iTunes' alternative album chart. His album Sing His Sad Heart spawned a hit single, Used to Be, and came off the heel of Matt's Def Leppard approved cover album of their iconic Pyromania, titled, very cleverly, Pyromatia, which shot to number 1 on iTunes' alternative album chart upon its release. Def Leppard's Joe Elliott called the album an amazing reinterpretation with heart and soul. Matt has performed on The Howard Stern Show, Ellen, Conan, Jimmy Kimmel Live, Dancing with the Stars, Rachel Ray, and the Country Music Association Awards. And last but certainly not least, Matt's most recent release is Achtung Matty, which he released this past Thursday in tribute to U2 and his most favorite album ever. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me. I'm so psyched to talk about this. Talk about you.
Like I said, it's an honor to have both of you on. So I've known of Lisa's work since before actually 1991. She was one of the music writers that I would follow quite religiously, and then Matt, I've known about you for a number of years, but I had no idea really that you were such a U2 fan until we had a conversation a couple weeks ago, which was
epic,
topping like to a brother, a kindred spirit. So
it's great. It feels like when you get to talk to folks about your favorite records, right? It feels like a breath of I felt like we could have gone on for 2 weeks talking on the phone about it. It was
exactly. Best. Yeah. So, and that was just about mostly Achtung Baby. So, imagine. So, let's start off, I guess, with sort of, let's start off with sort of first encounters. So I'll start with you, Elysa, because I think probably of all the people in the room, you were the first one to hear this record in terms of the context by which you heard it. Maybe you can describe, how you first encountered Achtung Baby and what was your sort of initial impressions at the time?
The first, initially I heard The Fly, which I believe was the first single.
Yes.
They did it kind of like an early single before Mysterious Waves, which I actually much preferred. I didn't love The Fly initially, and I still have to say it's certainly not among my favorite tracks on the album. But I did get an early copy of the album, and I just a couple listens and I was completely overwhelmed and overjoyed. I mean, it wasn't the U2, obviously it wasn't the U2 that I that I had known quite before, that had been so sort of kind of steeped in Americana, even I think going back to their earlier days before the Joshua Tree, when you consider that Unforgettable Fire was so inspired by Martin Luther King. Clearly this very spiritual vibe, this idea of these Irishmen who had fallen in love with America. And, you didn't get that at all from this album, because clearly they had gone in another direction again, without losing themselves or their identity as a band. And I think just the production, the melodies, I'm really a melody fascist. If the melodies aren't compelling to me, I don't care about anything else. And if I think the melody is cheesy or derivative, same thing. So that's kind of a tough criteria. And this album, just track after track, the melodies, the production, the lyrics, of course, they were clearly going in a different direction there. But it was something that was I found very accessible, very immediately. And my editor and I remember Anthony DeCurtis was reviews editor at Rolling Stone at the time, and he's kind of my mentor. And we both were quite blown away by it. We came into it as U2 fans, but this was after Rattle and Hum, when U2 had taken quite a beating in the press, and we were both thrilled to hear them coming back so strongly from Rattle and Hum, which I had actually had a lot of affection for some of the tracks on Rattle and Hum, but this was clearly them doing something new.
And just maybe you can explain just the mechanics. How did you get the assignment to actually do the lead review? I mean, Rolling Stone is, I think, still, certainly it was then, the leading music publication, not only in the United States, probably in the world, along with NME and Melody Maker and places like that. And so, how did you come? It seems like that's quite a plum assignment.
Yeah. It was sort of a kind of a leap of faith on Anthony's part, because again, I was 24. I had just started writing for Rolling Stone. Maybe within the past year, I'd been an assistant at Entertainment Weekly. Prior to that, just assistant to the music editor. And, Anthony and I had many conversations about music, and he knew I was a very passionate U2 fan. So, he made the leap of faith. And it wasn't the first assignment he gave me. I don't think it was the first lead either. I think that might have been Bonnie Raitt a few months before that, Luck of the Draw, if that came out before. I think those were both 91. But it was very intimidating because, reading all the other reviews by music critics and editors that I'd so admired, like Bill Flanagan, and people like that. It was really a plum that I wasn't quite sure I deserved at the time. And, I might have written it differently today.
Yeah,
you always
we'll
go back and criticize, but at least, I loved the album, and I hope that came through in the review, and I still do just as much.
Yeah, we'll get back to that. I think that sort of reevaluation part, but I was very struck by your review when I bought it, because I read all the music weeklies or monthlies religiously, and that was a review that I remember because it was about a record that I was my first reaction was sort of shock, and Rattle and Hum had left me a little bit out in the cold somewhat, certain things about it. And so to me, it was, a very, it was an abrupt change for me. And so I was reading voraciously lots of different things. So I should say, Anthony, we've had Anthony actually at our first conference. So, he's been a patron saint, I think.
Yes.
Matt, how about you? I think know from our discussion your origin story with this record, but please, I'd like you to share it.
Yeah. So I was a huge fan of Rattle and Hum. So I was coming in with a pretty. I think I came late to the U2 party, kind of like 83, kind of the end of war, kind of the Live in Our Blood Red Sky period, and I was like full-blown addict by the time Rattle and Hum came out. I went to high school in New Hampshire, in a boarding school, and I asked one of the teachers to drop me off at the cinema the Sunday that it came out on a Friday or whatever, and they dropped me off at like 45 minutes or 50 minutes away, the first showing of Rattle and Hum, and I sat through like 6 showings of it all day until they came to pick me up. So I was a super nerd for it. And again, like Elysa says, like in retrospect, you know, I can see it more sort of, I see why people didn't like it, you know, but at the time I was totally in. And so when Achtung Baby came out, I remember the first 2 things were the single for The Fly with Alex Descends into Hell for a Glass of Milk is the B-side, I believe. And I remember buying it at Rhino Records. I grew up in Massachusetts and then drove with my buddy Jeff all the way across the country to go to college in Southern California. And so there was still is a great record store in the town where I went to school. I went to a school called Pitzer, which was kind of a hippie, you know, like. Anyway, and I remember The Fly came out, and I didn't have the same reaction that you guys did to it, although I totally understand. It's understandable because I had that reaction when I saw the tour, the opening, or like couple nights in Boston, right? Like I saw the tour, and I was like kind of very not into it for the first, but it was a similar idea. I was like, where's Bono? Where's the guy I like that's sort of earnest? But I remember listening from just a pure sonic standpoint, putting the single in and playing the shit out of it. I just remember The Fly is still one of my favorite songs on that record and kind of in their catalog. And I think it just has to do with, there's like it just really moves me lyrically. I know it's little bit like sort of thrown off, a bunch of sort of like cute little sayings that come together, but it's the falsetto part in the chorus and the drive of the thing. And it was 1991, so it was the beginning of grunge, and this was November 18th, so I'd already been exposed to, you know, the Pixies put out Trompe le Monde, Pearl Jam put out 10, Temple of the Dog had come out, the Chili Peppers had put out Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and so it was like everything was already sort of heavy, and then all of a sudden here comes U2 sort of like joining in, whereas like a lot of bands that I loved up until that point really sounded fucking dated by that point. When they would put out their records, you'd be like, did anybody listen to what? And it was crazy that U2 was kind of hot on the heels of grunge with something that sounded really grungy. And so I went to the midnight sale it went on sale 12:01 at Rhino, and my buddy Jonah, who's still my friend today, one of my best friends, I met him. He was a senior and I was a freshman, and we went and like fucking milled around in the store listening to the record. It was really the first time we heard it was in the store, like with these people, and there's a line, so by the time we got in, it was like the middle of Even Better Than the Real Thing, so we didn't even get to kind of start it from the beginning. But I remember just kind of tripping and walking around and listening, and then it restarted because we kind of all hung out, right? It was like what everybody did. And then we took it home, and I lived on campus, he lived off campus, and we went to his place, his apartment, and just listened to the record over and over again until like the sun came up. And then he drove me back to school and I went to class, and it was a really influential period for me in terms of like I was wide open to like new shit, and my mind was being blown at every turn. And as a fan of U2, there was an element, and also I was at probably my most melodramatically vulnerable. And so, and this record is pretty melodramatically vulnerable. And so it destroyed me. I mean, and I listened to it. I don't think I've stopped listening to it.
I would agree. It's one of those records that doesn't tend to be far from the turntable, the virtual turntable, as so to speak.
Yeah.
I still listen to it on a regular basis. It is one of my favorite albums. Yeah.
It's so fun. And I remember reading your review in Rolling Stone, and I remember reading Bill's piece in Musician, which sort of was hugely influential in blowing my mind kind of even further out about like the depth of the record. Like when he placed it in this sort of, all of a sudden, because it was cinematic when you first heard it, and to follow it as like an actual narrative was a really like, I couldn't believe it. I mean, and growing up, I listened to Poison, and and they definitely did not do narrative, and so it was like this really fantastic. It was just magical.
Right.
Yeah.
I think cinematic is a good word for it. We can talk about that a little bit later, but I've often thought of it as a very cinematic record. It's almost like a film.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the context in which this record was released. And a lot of this is sort of well-trodden territory, you know, the po-faced pilgrims, you know, out of the desert, and, you know, Bono with the white flag and all that. And then, but maybe we can start, you know, just talk a little bit about, you know, each of your perspectives of, you know, where was U2 in their sort of in their career arc? What was happening in the greater music industry? Obviously, there was a lot going on in the world during that time. The first Gulf War was going on. Television was turned into a 24-hour, you know, news type of cycle and things like that. So the world was changing. But I'm sort of curious, where do you see this sort of them? Where were they before this record came out, and where could they have gone, and where, you know, they obviously took a very a different road. So what could have happened, I guess, with this band? Lisa, maybe because you have a lot of experience in this area in terms of music and artists, you know, art in other forms as well, theater and things like that. Where was U2 at that time, and where were they going, or where could they have gone in some way?
Yeah, well, you know, there were a number of things. As you mentioned, the wall had come down. You know, there was what was happening in Sarajevo. The world was in turmoil. And, you know, I think Joshua Tree had been an album that was very influenced by the United States in particular, as was Rattle and Hum, very much about their journey through the United States and their discovery. Not for the first time, you know, obviously any band as musical, as steeped in musical history as U2, you know, it wasn't like they were discovering B.B. King for the first time, but I think Bono has said in retrospect that there was almost an air to the film Rattle and Hum of, okay, well, yes, we're discovering your music, let us introduce you to your music. But I don't think that's where they were coming from. And I think even they have spoken of feeling misunderstood there and feeling like they had to kind of, I think at one point, Bono or one of the other members talked about having to chop down the Joshua Tree, or, you know, having to just completely rebuild from there. I believe there were some personal things going on too. I think The Edge's marriage might have been dissolving at that time. You know, I think those songs on the album, you know, very clearly, the first time I heard them, it's like, wow, they're kind of addressing love in a very sort of sexual way, you know, which you weren't quite. I mean, I always thought of them as a very sensual band, you know, deeply sensual, but not that, you know, not that sense of carnal knowledge that you really got from this album. And also, you know, with the Zoo TV tour, you saw this, but you saw it even, you heard it even on the album, just the great sense of which they've always had, the bigness, you know, that kind of, in a lesser band, I guess it could be called bombast or pretend, you know, just being overblown. But they have that thing that certain musicians, certain artists have of being able to, and I probably said something like this in my review, of being able to take those big statements and not seem overblown, to make them really purposeful and really moving, deeply moving. And I got that from all the songs on this album, and also that great sense of showmanship, which you saw more in the Zoo TV Zoo TV tour, excuse me, I just had dental surgery, so I'm a little, my mouth is a little addled today, but you definitely got that sense of performance, you know, I think Bono said in one interview around the time, might have been around the time of Achtung Baby or the Zoo TV tour, that, you know, you don't hear hip hop bands talking about selling out. That's a very modern rock thing. It's a very bourgeois thing. And I remember for that reason, actually not being a fan of grunge. It's like, why would I want to listen to this music or see this music live where these guys are like wearing plaid shirts and they don't even look like they want to put on a show for because, you know, I come from my first love is musical theater, you know, so, and I think there is a direct line between Rodgers and Hammerstein and Bono and the Edge. I mean, there's that kind of epic, not being afraid, transcending sentimentality as opposed to shying away from it. And I got that very much from the album. And I got it even more from the tour. Once The Fly and Mephisto eventually came out, this real sense of showmanship, of drama, which so many great artists, James Brown, Prince, all the great artists that I love as performers have. It's a show, honesty and showmanship are not mutually exclusive. And that's something I love about U2. Even in their earnest period, they were very much about, okay, we're here. Not that we matter so much, but the music matters. I think Bono has made that distinction. And I really got that with this album. And also the influence of German electronic music and of what was happening in Manchester, and that kind of irreverence, Dadaism, which I didn't know that much about, frankly, but that sense of irreverence and of kind of, okay, let's break things down a bit and let's not be so earnest and straightforward. Let's get away from the humanity to find the humanity. I think Bono also said something to that effect.
Yeah, I think that there were two quotes that I remember from the Sky Down documentary about this period. One was from Bono, who basically said that for them it was never about the musicians and the fame. It was like music is a sacrament to them. It's not the musicians. It's not that. And then with respect to the last point about the sort of the humanity, I think that Edge was saying about like the electronic music that he was getting into, bands like KFMBM and Kraftwerk, and that it was like by stripping away the humanity, or stripping away most of the humanity that was in that industrial music, what was sort of remaining was that much more. It's shown in some ways so much more than it was just a wash of emotion. And I think it's bands like 9 Inch Nails or something like that, where there can be a lot of noise, but at the same time it can also be very sort of focused on a particular emotion and things like that, and sort of stripped down to something sort of the bare element. So it's mixing, I think, like you said, they're not in contradiction with one another.
Right.
Matt, how about yourself in terms of, you had mentioned about, how you felt about Rattle and Hum, but where do you sort of see what was going on in terms of the music industry, and U2 sort of making a change? And as an artist yourself, where have you felt at times in that same sort of position where you want to do something different, but at the same time you perhaps are struggling with, am I going to lose my audience? Am I going to?
Yeah, I think so. To the U2 point, what I think the only artists that are interesting to me over the long throw historically are people who, like Michael Jackson made Thriller, and it was like the biggest record of his career, and you could argue it sort of like paralyzed him for the rest of his career, right? From a creative standpoint. You could argue, it's been said about Wildflowers that Tom Petty's, that record was sort of the apex of his creative experience, and from there he was stalled after that, right? And the same with a band like Def Leppard. Hysteria was so big, there's like, where do you go? And what I think is so badass about Bowie, what I think is so badass about Prince, what I think is so badass about Joni Mitchell, and those are three pretty otherworldly people, right? I mean, those are aliens, right? Creative aliens. You two are like 4 very normal human beings. Like, they are very unexceptional. It doesn't mean they're not exceptional in the way they do things. Like, Bono's incredibly charismatic and can carry but like from a creative standpoint, they are 4 very human beings. And what has always been so amazing to me about bands like U2 is that they could recognize the magical thing that occurs in the chemistry of them together, and they could transcend their sort of humanness and become exceptional and find exceptional things within that. Prince, it felt like he just shit magic. You know what I mean? Like, and it doesn't mean there weren't records that were like, ugh, and it doesn't mean and it doesn't mean he couldn't have, collaboration would have really benefited him, a real collaboration, not like Wendy and Lisa. That's real, but you know what I mean? Real push and pull. But U2 was like this democracy. The U2 sort of always puts friendship at above everything. And I think that was what's so fascinating about, so getting back to your question, I think it's unbelievable that after the Joshua Tree and after kind of the Rattle and Hum sort of misstep, I always that they pulled a move like this and did Achtung Baby, and that then they pulled a move like Pop. And to me, Metallica is another great example of a band that, like, creatively, you could see the first couple Metallica records kind of sound the same, but their move to do the Black Album, then Load and Reload, then Saint Anger, then the Lou Reed Project, at a certain point they got really fun, and they really started understanding that, like, the joy for them is to sort of like do things that won't necessarily please their audience. And that's like an incredibly brave thing for anyone to do, but for the biggest band in the world to do it, you know, like we have a band like Coldplay who talks like they do it, you know, everybody talks, ever since U2 did it, and Bono said, like, we're chopping down the Joshua Tree and we got to go back and dream it all up again. All these other bands, Springsteen, someone put in the, Springsteen also is supposed, so I have a big, Springsteen is supposedly not a democracy. No, Springsteen, I have a real, anyway, Springsteen's a great example of somebody who pretends to move forward because he controls the narrative, and really he's just stayed the same, if not regressed. But I think what's so magical about U2 is that they did it, and then they didn't care about it. Like, they didn't care that they were changing. They were doing what they wanted to do on a certain level. And then the same with Pop. And you could argue that later era U2, the problem, at least from my perspective, is that they kind of got scared, right? Because Pop was sort of a disaster. And then all of a sudden they started leaning on their strengths. And I think a band that leans on their strengths is kind of a dead fish. I think, like, a band that knows their strengths and then moves from those places forward, that is an alive, magical entity. And like Nick Cave or PJ Harvey, or, you know, like, never, but for the biggest band in the world to not be paralyzed by their biggest record of all time and their biggest failure of all time, like, and then to sort of turn it on its head and come back with something that sounded nothing like anything they'd ever done, and then succeed with that, I mean, that is the fucking answer. I mean, that's what everybody wants. That's what we all want, because the world is full of people that just follow. And it's like, it's just because everybody's terrified. And so for a band to take that kind of risk and do it as a unit, it's great. I love it.
I think one thing that's remarkable that I've always thought was very special about U2, obviously it's the same four individuals from the get-go. No changes, but even more than that, they are, and sometimes during my frustrations with the band over their career, where it's sort of like, you know, for me, the 90s U2 was the ultimate. That's the golden era to me. I love everything. I love things since then, but it's not quite the same. And when I think about it, then I have to remind myself, it's four individuals. It's with Springsteen or Bowie or Prince or Joni.
Yep.
You have
Correct.
One person, and here you have a democracy. Maybe it's five, because it used to be, you know,
Paul.
Paul, right?
Yeah, but and also, and they're all best friends with their same best friends,
right.
And they're all.
Right.
It's like there's a great story. A friend of mine, Pearl Jam was opening for U2 in Europe, and they were at their sort of like real pulling apart period where Eddie like was traveling separately, and they didn't even know if they wanted to be a band. I think I told you the story, but. The Edge invited them to an after party, and like, so Jeff Ament and Stone showed up, and they go to the back of this thing like at 3 a.m. and around this like table are the four members of U2, like everybody's milling around, and then there's the four guys in U2 kind of like shoulder to shoulder, and the Edge gets up and goes, hey, and goes to talk to him, and Stone said something to the effect of like, how are you guys are like sitting together? Like, our band doesn't even fucking talk, you know? And and that was where the Edge said something to the effect of, well, yeah, we put friendship above everything. So above the music, you know, we put our relationship above everything. And like, at that time, or whatever it is, and I'm still probably it is now, but it's like, and in that way, I think that's what makes them kind of one unit, which is why Achtung Baby is such a, and not to like but that's why Achtung Baby is such a fascinating record, because it's been documented so much that it was the moment where there was a real break in the unity, right? And Bono says in From the Sky on Down, he says it was a betrayal, right? Every man for himself is a betrayal of the idea of a band. And it's like, so everybody calls Bono a fucking megalomaniac, and everybody calls Bono a sociopath, or whatever everybody likes to say. But it's like, I don't know any sociopaths that are still hanging out with their best friends from the time they were a kid, are married to the same person they've been married to, have two, it's like, and is in a democracy where the drummer can say, this sucks. And they go, yep, okay, what sucks about it, Larry? And they go, okay, and they work it through. It's like, it's a really great business model.
Yeah.
And a creative model.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the album itself. We haven't already, but I sort of try to sort of encapsulate, I think, for each of you, sort of the themes that you see running through it. And, there's the obvious things about Edge's marriage, the and how that was not just, the guitarist's girlfriend or wife is it's not going to be part of it. There was like you said, that they were actually not just brothers together, but that whole circle of people sort of came out of the Shalom group and things like that. They were all intertwined. They all had their names from the village and things like that. And so for them, it probably was more than just, this one person is no longer going to be part of this bigger family. I'm sure it was not just on the Edge, it was on all of them and so on. So I'm sort of curious, what are the themes that resonate to you? Matt, why don't we first start with you? And whatever you think in terms of just the obvious ones that people have talked about, betrayal, love, but what else does this album sort of speak to you, both lyrically but also musically?
There's the thing that I think is unique to this record in the canon of U2's records is it's really the first and only time that I can see lyrically and emotionally where Bono gets kind of like, go fuck yourself-y. Do you know what I mean? Like there's not really, when you lead up to this and when you lead out of this, I would say this record is sort of the most Bob Dylan indebted lyrical, the most sort of Bukowski. It's been documented that it's Bukowski and it's Delmore Schwartz and all that stuff, but you can really feel lyrically like this was the only place in their canon where like he'll tell, like, so cruel, acrobat, there's real like vitriol and sort of like, and that never happened again. Like it never happened before and it never happened again. It would, like, he would be mad about, like, a little bit on Rattle and Hum, right? Like God Part 2 about, Goldman, his type's like a curse, instant karma's going to get him, but if I don't get him first, but whatever. But really, Achtung Baby exists in this, to me, it's, and again, this could be all of my projection, but it's the most vulnerable this band has ever been. Like it really, and it's also the most sense of humory the band has ever been. So it's like the most self-aware because they're sort of tongue in cheek, but then at the same time within that, they must have felt safe enough to be as honest as they could be. And it's like, doesn't mean there's not honest moments before or after this, but this whole record to me, even in the moments like, even like you said, the sort of sensuality, but then the sexuality, like there's a real, like the carnal aspect of it. There's a real reveal because the Bono and the Edge and all those people that we see all the time, that's just not who they are. They're body fucking drinking, swearing, but the image that they project is this sort of like, is the shtick, right? And so Achtung Baby was this rad moment for me from a listening perspective where all of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, this is the shit. Like Lou Reed, like this is the shit that Lou Reed does all the time, right? Like Lou Reed is an idiot sometimes, but he's never not as honest as, he's never not honest in his sort of crazy, but Lou Reed's lyrics are always so sort of like even the cover of Ecstasy, that record is like him masturbating supposedly. And it's like Lou Reed did that. That was like his whole persona. And he maybe took it to an extreme, but this was the moment where I feel like, cause pop, it gets self-conscious and it gets kind of rich person, You know what I mean? But like Achtung Baby is this great moment where you're like, these 31-year-old kids do not have, they are fucking, they don't know what they're doing, and it's really great. Like, and Lanois guiding and Eno guiding and Flood guiding, and it's like there was this great, and again, in a creative relationship, and I'll stop talking. In a creative relationship, as we all know, there are these peaks and valleys, and this was sort of peak Daniel Lanois, like peak Lanois. And Eno would kind of come in and help, but Lanois was at his finest, in my opinion, because
Right.
you know, and they were at their finest in their working relationship. And it's just sort of a great thing, because a record is really a record of an event, and this record is a record of these kids and this guy and these people coming together. And again, the mythology around it or whatever, but you hear it in the record is like, these are people that are figuring it out and don't know, and are letting things like, I'm pissed, I want to have sex, I like fucking, I like being angry, I like fighting. It all comes out in this record in a way where the other records kind of like maybe hint at it or shy away from it, but this record's like very much it. And it's in the artwork, it's everything about it. It's real,
Right.
feels like a carnal is a great word that you used.
Yeah, yeah. Well, vitriol is a great word that you used. I'm thinking of the lyric, I'm only holding on to watch you go down.
My
And then
love,
that's
my
so
love.
cruel. Oh my
Oh,
God.
at the
you
end,
know?
my love. Oh.
Yeah, yeah. That's there's some really dark stuff on the album, but I think there's also great joy on the album. You know, there's no nihilism in U2. You know, that sort of, you know, and that comes through not just in their whatever message they put forth or in whatever lyrics they're writing, but in the music itself. I mean, you know, Matt, you mentioned Lanois. I think just the sheer sonic majesty of this album, whether it's One or Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses. I mean, my God, that mix of sort of like that sort of sonic assault, and at the same time incredibly warm and incredibly melodic. And as a musician, I'm sure you have more insight into how they all achieve that than I do. But yeah, there was that mix of light and dark, you know, and of just being, you know, whereas before they'd had a reputation for being earnest. In a way, this was the most, as you said also, Matt, vulnerable and raw that I'd ever heard them. You know, there was no buffer, there was no, you know, Jesus or Martin Luther King or you know, problems in Central America. It was really so intimate. You'd never heard them so intimate before. And I mean, for all I know, Jesus is somewhere on the album and I missed it. Or I'm forgetting about it right now, you know, because they're always drawing on so much, and there are all these allusions and references and puns. You know, I think the band is a lot more clever than they get credit for being. You know, you think of a song, I was talking about the joy, you think of a song like Mysterious Ways. If you want to kiss the sky, gotta learn how to kneel. You know, I mean, just there's really some genius lyrics, again, in a very unpretentious, you know, whatever pretentiousness they've been accused of previously. This album really stripped it down, and at the same time, I think, had a lot of their most eloquent work. And but for me, in the end, it was just the combination, the music and the way the music was produced and arranged, was just mind-blowing and soul, you know,
Right.
so soulful.
So Elysa, you had mentioned earlier about you see a direct sort of lineage from like Rodgers and Hammerstein to Bono and Edge. Can you maybe discuss that a little bit more with respect to, in particular, this record? And would you say that that sort of and I'm not a theater person in any way. I love going to the theater, but I don't know much about the art form, for that matter, about a lot of musical art forms. But where do you see, in terms of sort of that lineage, and do you think that was influencing them as much as, say, other songwriting that might influence them, say like a Lennon and McCartney or a Dylan or something like that? I'm curious.
I don't know that Rodgers and Hammerstein were a direct influence. I mean, I know they have an interest in musical theater and obviously did a musical themselves with Spider-Man later on, which I think got a raw deal, quite frankly, for much of the same reasons that some of their music has gotten a raw deal. But that's a whole other conversation. Rodgers and Hammerstein are probably most famous for shows like Oklahoma, The Sound of Music, Carousel, The King and I, and they wrote these sort of epic, sweeping, gorgeous scores and stories. South Pacific is another one. That really addressed pretty heavy stuff like racism, domestic violence, war, and people who I think either just sort of were dismissive of musical theater generally, or, maybe thought that, their stuff is just a little too Trieckley, never appreciated that fully. I mean, if you know Stephen Sondheim's music, who's another great hero of mine, he was a protege of Oscar Hammerstein, who's probably the greatest lyricist, librettist in musical theater. And his whole thing was that he could take, well, not his whole thing. I mean, I couldn't sum up his whole thing because his brilliance, but he could take statements that seemed incredibly simple, but were just so profound, find profundity in places that seem simple. And also, I see that. And also, again, dig really deep in a way that was very accessible and could even be written off as sentimental if you didn't really appreciate it, or if you sort of, if you see The Sound of Music as raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, if you're going to dismiss it that way. In both cases you have music and lyrics that very much work together, that very much complement each other. The genius of Richard Rodgers, for me, maybe the greatest melodist of the 20th century, and again, I don't want to get too far afield, was that he worked with Hammerstein, and before that he worked with a guy named Lawrence Hart, whose lyrics were much more dry, and the music was different. And with U2, it's very much about how the music and lyrics come together and suit each other so beautifully and are so fearlessly emotional. Right. It's so much easier to be clever than it is to try to say something profound.
Or amen. To say something honest. I mean, to say something genuinely honest, and from that is, at least creatively for me, is the hardest possible thing, to not want to couch it in something, like you said, something clever, right? That idea of well, I'm smart, or look at how I'm delivering this to you. That I think it's the Irish aspect of, not to sort of group that, but having my mother's side of the family and watching that go down. There's this real earnest. Earnest is an ugly word, right? But there's there's always been an expulsive emotional experience that happens from U2, right? From Bono, really. And so, and it's never been particularly, whether it be early morning April 4, right, in Pride, when Martin Luther King was definitely not killed in the morning. But that's what's so fascinating about, he didn't, or getting up on stage with Bob Dylan, not knowing the lyrics and just making them up as he went. There was a bravado and a vulnerability to do that or playing songs on television before Joshua Tree came out, playing 2 songs that were unreleased, and it's a disaster. If you've ever seen the footage, it was sort of legendary to me, of Trip Through Your Wires, and there was maybe it was Spring Hill. There was 2 songs, maybe Banana Fish was the other one. David, you can sort of help me in a YouTube nerdy. What is it? Womanfish. And do you remember? And it was, and I remember getting a bootleg of it, and then finally when you watch it, you're like, this is a fucking disaster. And watching the Paris concert that came along with Joshua Tree, where they had to restart songs and they didn't know what they were doing. It's 4 different people playing, but here's a band that went on a stadium fucking tour where they couldn't really, they were figuring it out as they went. They were building the road as they were making it. And they like to do this thing where they talk about punk rock, and it gets a little bit annoying where they're we're punk rock. But they really were punk rock. Bono couldn't even sing. Adam couldn't even play. Do you know, none of them could, yet they built this road as they went, and they did it with this sort of face first attitude, and it lasted for a very long time, which is so rare. And somebody said, you know, and I would say All That You Can't Leave Behind is the moment where they stopped leading with their face. Right. And it doesn't mean there's not great songs on that. Atomic Bomb's got great songs, No Line on the Horizon, but they led with their face through like 8 or 9, and like I'm an REM fanatic. They never led. Michael Stipe never. Maybe Everybody Hurts, but it's so pandering on a certain level. It's like, and I love Michael Stipe, but rarely did you get a glimpse into that band for who they actually were. U2 was just fucking like taking it in the fucking face. It's so great. And it's like, yeah, it's.
Yeah.
I'm a little conscious of time. I do want to talk about one other thing, but I did want to say one thing with Elysa. Thank you about the explanation about the Roger Hammerstein.
Yeah, sorry. I hope I didn't go off on.
No, it was great.
No.
I want to dig in all of it now. I want to dig. I gotta get. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that occurs to me is what I always think that you know, people think of the '90s as, you know, starting with Achtung Baby, and actually, I mean, U2 and dance culture actually started with the War record. You know, Francois Kevorkian did a bunch of remixes for songs off of that, and God Part 2, I think, is almost sort of proto, you know, '90s, and then obviously their cover of Night and Day. So Cole Porter obviously was involved in theater as well as just, you know, music and so on. And when I heard that song, I remember thinking, this is, you know, there's something special here. The video, not so much, but sorry, Vim Vendors, you're great, but I'm not happy.
I think Bono looked sexy as shit in that video. I loved it.
It's that contradiction of the old U2 with the new sound of U2.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting point. I wanted to sort of briefly talk about Berlin and where you think Berlin sort of fits into this. There was obviously, as you said, Elysa, you know, the wall coming down and so on. There's Hansa and the ghosts of Hansa, you know, Bowie, Iggy, you know, influences like Wim Wenders and Rilke. But do you think that's sort of not really there, or do you think that there's actually something there? That was Berlin sort of necessary for them to have that moment of revelation with one that somehow broke the broke the logjam, so to speak, and allowed them to actually make this record?
Me, you're asking?
Yeah. Yes.
Both. Well, clearly from their perspective, there was, from everything I've read and seen, you know, they found Berlin to be a very, very dark, gloomy place just at that point in time. And the experience was kind of grueling. I think, was it Adam or somebody in the band called it a baptism by fire? They really, it wasn't like they necessarily had the grandest time there. And didn't they wind up at some party or rally they thought was for the wall going down, but it was a protest of the wall going down, which is like perfect, because they were, you know, it just goes to show you, they were clearly, I mean, as you mentioned before, they were, all bands come to a place of conflict, even if they're best friends and blood brothers. And I think perhaps, you know, after Rattle and Hum, this was a reckoning for them. But then I think they also got back to Dublin, isn't that right? And you know, so I think probably both places were very important. And, you know, the fact that also I'm sure from what I've read and heard, Berlin allowed them a degree of anonymity, and Bowie has spoken about that, where, you know, it's not easy for the biggest rock band in the world, which they were at that point, to be able to enjoy that. So they were really able to sort of come to terms with themselves and with each other. And, you know, frankly, I'm not even, I shouldn't be too presumptuous. I'm not even sure to what degree of conflict there was between the band members at that point. I think probably, you know, they realized that they'd come to a point where within the band, you know, it was time to kind of reassess and reevaluate. They obviously had personal things too. Look, they had turned 30 recently. That's a milestone in anyone's life. And if your marriage, as in the case of The Edge, apparently, again, I don't have personal knowledge of his story, but from everything I read and gleaned, you can certainly hear that impact on the record. And of course, Berlin has such a rich history of art, from the Weimar era and before that, but with cabaret. So, and you can, that I'm sure in some way those sort of vibes or ghosts or whatever you want to call them wound up inspiring the tour. The fact that the tour was so theatrical and so irreverent in a way that people did not expect of U2 at that point.
And I'm guessing cabaret also played into Mephisto as a character, which maybe we can have you back for our third of our trilogy of conferences to talk about that, because I think that's a real, I think there's a deep, I think I can see a deep love of cabaret. I think a lot of this is Gavin Friday's influence, perhaps, on Bono.
Yeah, that too, right.
But
Gavin was such an essential part, and the idea that they would always kind of go, whether it was Morocco for No Line on the Horizon, or they started to really, or even Unforgettable Fire, going to Slane Castle and then coming back, or doing that house that Adam bought for Joshua Tree. I feel like they always kind of went, even when they were within Ireland, they would always kind of go somewhere, and then they'd end up back at Windmill Lane or back at their headquarters to kind of like pull things together. But when they started to do the exploration period, like Achtung Baby, it was like, I at least from what I've read, it feels like they went to sort of like throw paint and figure things out, and then once they started to get a shape of it, they'd take it back to where they lived and sort of mess with it a little bit. That seemed to be their plan, and also something that many bands, Coldplay, the perfect example of a band that tries to ape every step that, and I like Coldplay, but like Coldplay does the same thing. They're like, we're going here to do this thing, and then we're going to take it back to our studio and mess with it. It's like, it's all very U2 centric. Whereas like Bowie, I think went to Hansa, did the record. I think like those records were done and finished there. Like I think all the Idiot and all those records, he didn't like take them home to fix them up. I don't think, but
right. Low and Lodger, I think, were the same way.
Yeah,
and we're done primarily, there and.
Yeah, and U2 would go like, it's like a field trip. They'd go to like a field trip for like 6 months, you know what I mean? And like, and then they'd come back and be like, well, what did we learn on the field trip? Well, and that's Adam Clayton says in this documentary where he says, we didn't necessarily get the sonics of the record there, but we got the heart of the record there. Yep. And that's really what it was, is like, get away from our families, get away from the thing, and go explore this together as a unit, and then come back and then sort of dissect.
Yeah.
We got some good questions, by the way. I don't want to miss them.
No, I'm gonna just we'll have a brief sort of summary, I think. So can you both speak, Matt first, maybe, about influences you sort of see? I mean, you just mentioned Coldplay, but where do you see the influences of U2, both on their own subsequent work? Is it one of those things where, after pop, they sort of went on to a different train track, perhaps, on a not back to the same one that they had been on, but a different one, and they've sort of been on that? Or do you see them influences of Achtung Baby throughout their career afterwards, in terms of how they approach perhaps songwriting? And what you hear when you listen to the records, and then other artists I'm curious about.
Okay, so obviously the way that they did that record, vocally, once Lan Juanino came on board on Unforgettable Fire, they really changed the way they made records, right? Like they started singing in the control, Bono started singing in the control room, holding the mic, all that stuff. And that's why I was listening to Achtung Baby the day of its release. I was like listening, I was in the shower in Boston listening to the whole record. And I was amazed at how like lo-fi everything is. His vocals as well. You can hear him moving the mic around. It's like there was a real capture the moment thing that started happening with Unforgettable Fire that they kept throughout their whole career. You can hear it. And when they did that record, that Skid song with the Green Day guys, they like set up in the Bono. It's like they just always do records like that now. So that was sort of the Lanois influence, and the Eno influence was for the rest of their career, you know, at least from what I can tell. And I always like to see U2 as sort of like stages, right? So the first stage was kind of the punk stage. Then the second stage was like the punk, the punk. It was like theater stage, you know, the punk theater stage. And then after when All That You Can't Leave Behind came out, it became more like the clean, earnest stage, right? Where it's like, although 360 was a little bit, you know, but I always saw them as three separate things. And now I feel like their new stage is sort of like grandfathers like talking to their grandkids. Do you know what I mean? Like, which is crazy because they're not that old. But I think that like thematically they seem to always like now Bono's just so earnest and he'll be like, you know, and even songs I love, Get Out of Your Own Way, like that's a real fucking straight shot of a lyric. You know, same with Stuck in a Moment You Can't Get Out of. Like all of a sudden he became, I still haven't found I'm looking for is like a poetic version of that, but like Stuck in a Moment You Can't Get Out of is like there's not a whole lot of poetry in that lyric, but it's very true. Do you know what I mean? And like, and everything started anyway. And from an influence standpoint, I think every band that's of that age, that came of age at that time, the Killers, Coldplay, any band that was, you know, even Suzanne Vega to a degree, like Billy Idol. Like I remember Billy Idol did Cyberpunk, and I don't know when 99.9 Fahrenheit degrees, that Mitchell Froom, Suzanne Vega record came out, but I believe it came out right after that. It's like everybody started doing this thing where it was like, let's make things sound crazy and like it's industrial and like, and some of those records are really good, but like they were hugely, when a band like U2 on that level makes a shift like that, no matter who they're kind of thieving from, right? Like no matter what Connie Plank record they're taking their shit from or whatever, it's like Madonna. Once it goes to sort of the big screen, then everybody sees it and everybody attributes it to them. And so I feel like almost every band from 1991 on started making records that were, I mean, Def Leppard made Slang. Like everybody was like, yeah, we make sort of weird, cool, artsy records. And it's like, you know what I mean? But like,
Yeah.
you know, and so blah, blah, blah. But that's.
Yeah. Speaking of, just one comment on grandfathers. Edge is a grandfather.
Oh, yeah, he is.
Oh.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
so,
right.
Elysa, how about you about influences both them on their later work, but also on the rest of the music industry and society?
Oh, well, I would completely agree with Matt. Their influence has been just so diffuse and you know, and I think even stretching back before Achtung Baby, you know, that sort of chiming big sound, you know, that it's not, I think particularly Edge's guitar is so distinctive and has been so influential. And I think as a band, they've influenced, I mean, Coldplay is probably the most obvious. I've often said that, what's the Coldplay hit that I think is a total rewrite of Beautiful Day? I can't remember, but I don't remember the song specifically. It's probably true for more than one of their songs, but yeah, they influence so many bands. It's hard to pinpoint. And also what Matt said about you know, that kind of lo-fi thing continuing, and something I've always noticed about Bono's singing that I think is a credit to the production is the various producers they've worked with, but particularly Lanois, you know, is the warmth, and that you can hear him breathing, you can hear him swallowing. That is so rare in music nowadays, you know, particularly in popular music, you know. So I'm sorry, I'm doing this with my phone, so you may hear little pings, and you may also hear our dog who's starting to make some noise. But yeah, I think you know, I just think, and also Bono just as a presence. I mean, I think you know, again, whatever people think of as his grandiosity, I think he's also there's a humility and a curiosity there that I think is rare among, and even in the way he's tried to sort of veer into not so much politics, but activism. What other pop star has spoken with Sarah Palin?
Right.
Or even the Pope, or who was it? Strom Thurmond he met with at one point. I mean, I'm not sure.
Jesse
but,
Helms, I think.
Jesse Helms, thank you. Well, same idea.
Yeah, exactly.
The people, it's very easy to preach to the choir. And Bono has never contented himself with doing that. And I think that speaks to not only a humility, but an intelligence, quite frankly, that is rare.
This is sort of a hot take, and I don't know how people that are, luckily there's not, it's nobody's going to get, but I think that there was a shift in Bono from the music being the most important thing in the world to the activism being the most important thing in the world. I can hear the difference in the records. The Edge kind of started taking over the records more, and it became, and so Bono as a creative force, I feel like shifted his focus at a certain point, and the world benefited from it from a real standpoint, right? Like debt relief and all that stuff. But I feel like you can't be, you can't have your feet in two places. And that's why I think U2's work, once his activism started happening, it doesn't mean the records don't have magical moments. It doesn't, but like, it's sort of like Lanois said, when he used to make records, he would be all in and he would just be 100% there. And now when he's interviewed, he says, I don't have that kind of stamina. I don't want to spend that much time. I don't want to give that much energy to records. And like, you can tell, like Lanois' finest period, whether from from Apollo all the way through to maybe even Time Out of Mind, which I love, you can it's like he was there and he was committed. So that's pretty much, I would say that's the chunk. And it's like, I feel like at a certain point, how long can you be very famous and very rich and very powerful before you lose your focus on the thing that you're doing and you change directions and you think, like, I love music, but we've really done this. And like, what I want to do now is this. And so I feel like Bono, all the magic that makes Bono so incredible on the records I love is now directed at sort of this other humanitarian thing, and I back it. But I think it's at the sacrifice of my favorite band, which is always tough. But whatever, you know what I mean? Like the Smiths lasted for 5 years, the Beatles lasted for 5, U2's lasted for it's like, I don't think rock and roll is supposed to go this long. And so it's like, doesn't mean there's not going to be a renaissance for them at some point, like the I dream of the Johnny Cash period. I dream of U2's elder period where all of a sudden they're like, somebody comes in and helps them be very honest in a way that but actually and poetically honest, and then something emerges that's different, and I'll always hold out hope for that. But I just think that's what I think, shifting focus. But yeah,
before we get to the question, I just want to something, Elysa, you said that it sort of struck me was that I think of the Unforgettable Fire, which of course is the first time Eno and Lanois were working with them. The breathing, I can really hear that sort of, the breaths, there's even mistakes. There's a profanity during the song, The Unforgettable Fire, at the very beginning. It's in my ears that I hear a shit that gets said, and it's interesting because it's just, you can tell that there's a certain for lack of a better word, ambient aspect that they wanted to highlight, or maybe the band wasn't even aware of it, but at least the producers were. And I think that has helped in all the records, even All That You Can't Leave Behind, which was also produced by them.
1,000%.
It was probably the most straight, thing. The other thing I was going to say, something that Scott had said yesterday during the thing, is with respect to the film, I do encourage people to see, From the Sky Down. What I think is interesting is I didn't think of the connection until Scott mentioned it yesterday about the film Let It Be and Peter Jackson's upcoming Beatles thing, because it's not that it is sort of interesting. It's about 5 albums in, and of course the Beatles were no more after that. Of course, they actually did a record after Let It Be, which is one of their most acclaimed, Abbey Road. But what's I think interesting is that they were also a band that was sort of having difficulty, and obviously that they did not survive that difficulty ultimately. I mean, they had one more record to do, which was a great record, but U2 obviously came out of that sort of moment of turmoil and were able to survive, and perhaps found the necessary thing to keep them going, where other bands would have imploded or just produced the same old thing.
Like Coldplay took from U2, we cannot underestimate how much the Beatles had such an impact on the way U2 does everything they did up in it, because like, and if you listen to the Beatles records, talk about breaths, like they were the originators of like John
Everything.
Lennon's vocal takes, you know what I mean? Like McCartney's vocal takes, those are some fucking raw, and I don't even like the Beatles. And like listening to it, you're transfixed because like that's human beings playing music in a room, and like you can hear it. And like especially on Abbey Road, especially on the Let It Be sessions, it's like and they took so much from the way that band evolved. They took that, it's almost like they took that blueprint and they were like, yeah, we can be brave, we can totally be brave, the Beatles were brave, let's do it, you know, let's evolve.
I do want to open up for questions. The chat has lots of questions, but I think given the time, and I do want to encourage sort of live questions, I want to open it up. So for people who would like to ask a question, let's first of all see if you can raise your hand by clicking reactions on the bottom bar. We can see if there's anyone who's would like to speak. If not, I will sort of just open it up, but then it might be a free-for-all. So does anyone have any questions?
Sherry raised her hand.
Sherry did. Okay. Oh, yep. Sherry, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I had asked this in the chat about if you feel that U2 had a bit more creative freedom at the start of the 90s, more so because they were with Island, they were with Principal Management, you know, they had just come off of a strong 1980s, even though Rattle and Hum didn't do as well as everybody had wanted, but they had that creative freedom that in, you know, after pop, they were kind of put in a pressure chamber by the record label to produce something that could be more palatable for the more commercial audience, thus bringing us into 2000 and All That You Can't Leave Behind and so on and so forth. And then later in the 2000s, they leave Paul McGuinness, they join Maverick, that then becomes part of Live Nation. So I'm wondering if they've been basically creatively castrated because of the corporate gods, basically.
So,
and
yeah.
if you think that there will be another creative spurt coming out of them with that same fervor that we saw out of Achtung Baby. Thanks for taking the question.
I love that question. Can I take that?
Yeah, that's for you. You address that better than I would as an artist yourself. Yeah.
So all that I've ever learned about U2 is that all of that kind of pressure, unfortunately, or fortunately, comes from Bono. So it's like they're not really told by anybody what to do because they make so much money, you know, just it's like, I think I like to think as like an outside observer that Bono's desire to be the biggest band in the world was really helpful to a certain point. And then at a certain point, it became a real detriment, right? Because Bono wants so badly to be he wants so badly to be current. He wants so badly to be played on the radio. He wants so badly to be in the mix. And he says as much, but he also shows us as much in the records he makes. And you just can't do that, right? Like you can do it when you're a kid, but like when you have to really settle into who you are at a certain point, because fame, that train disappears, and it's bigger than U2. Fame is bigger than U2, and like being famous is bigger than U2, and being current on the radio, and the way that the industry has changed, it's changing every fucking week. And so it's a fool's errand to think that somehow you can be competitive. And I think for a long time, Bono sort of felt like that was the most important thing, right? We got to make a big statement. And again, I don't know what it's like to have a band that's a corporation that's that big, that employs that many people. So I'm talking pretty much out of my ass. But from a sideline perspective, Bono seems to be the reason why that band is having so much trouble coming to terms with being U2. Like it's funny how that works, that like the strength becomes the sort of the thing that maybe cuts into the thing that makes it good. And so U2 kind of exists. It doesn't mean that it's not important for the bottom line of the label. It doesn't mean that they're not have to bring in the money for all that stuff. But from what I've been told and what I know, U2 rarely was motivated by anyone telling them anything. And it pretty much exclusively comes from Bono. And I think the Paul McGuinness move was a Bono move. Like, I think all these things that happened, I don't think anybody tells U2 what to do. And they do it, and for better or for worse on our end, for them it's better, you know, for them it's a better move. Like, who are we to judge whether or not having Guy Oseary, you know, as a side person, I can look on and be like, why the fuck did you have Guy Oseary manage you? Like, why did you have any of this thing happening? Why did you do this? Why can't you do this? And it makes me mad because I'm so committed in theory to this band, but that's me being committed to who I think that band should be. That band needs to be who they are going to be. And I think it's safe to say that all those decisions come within the band. Like, as much as we'd like to sort of like blame the big bad or whatever, it's so that being said, you can always hope for sort of this resurrection moment where all of a sudden they get it figured out, and all of a sudden they, you know, it's like, oh, fuck, this is great. Like, that's why I always hold out hope. It's like nobody tells Metallica what to do either. You know, they're not on a label anymore, but same idea.
I want to bring up a question that someone asked in the chat, that basically, and this sort of maybe can tie also to Elysa, your work with theater and so on, is, you know, since tours are always expensive. Matt, I'm sure you can attest to, you know, touring being an expensive sort of proposition. But obviously, let's say starting with the Joshua Tree, you know, U2 went on tour in stadiums, and so stadiums, the size of that would entail a great deal of money being put. And Achtung Baby and Zoo TV obviously was that way. Pop was that way. The 360 tour was that way, and the Redux Joshua Tree tour a few years ago was that way.
Yeah.
How much control does a band have in, you know, in that artistic way when there are so much financial risks, you know, involved? And obviously Spider-Man is legendary in that respect, with respect to, you know, not only the artistic tensions between, you know, Julie Taymor and Glenn Berger and the band, you know, Bono and Edge, but also just the whole financial backing. Is that a straitjacket for the art?
You know, because I'm not a musician and I don't have to deal with the practical aspects of it, I've sort of, even in my advanced stage, clung to this romantic notion that artists put art first. But that's not, of course, they have to take practical considerations into it. And the guys in U2 have been around a long time, and they're all smart. And I'm sure financial considerations come into it, but I also, you know, they're an immensely successful band. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I really don't know to what extent. I would think that hopefully they have people they can trust, that they rely on to sort of weigh the risks. But, you know, they're also a band at this point that I think, particularly post Zoo TV, people expect or want something spectacularly entertaining from them. And, you know, that's, I would think, when you're a band that is known for its showmanship, that is known for making epic gestures, you know, that's part of the risk. You know, I would think, you know, they're not touring constantly, so and they're not releasing music constantly. So I would imagine it's everything is measured and everything is considered along those lines. But I couldn't really address that. Matt, would you know any more about that?
I mean,
maybe about.
So in terms of money, like, U2 is so rich. I don't think we even understand the
Right.
full scope of like how much money they have. Like, we're talking
That's
about
what I
as
thought.
if it matters. Like, they have so much fucking money that and to them, I'm pretty sure that the tours are based on like box office so that they can be the biggest band, and like that seems to always be it. Like 360 was a in the round situation so they could sell all the seats. And again, there isn't a spectacle aspect to it, but just to bring practicality into it, Bono wants to be the person where they like the biggest tour of the year was U2, like the biggest thing in the world was U2. Like, he just really does. I don't relate to it. I don't understand it, but it's like it's the thing that elevated them to such great heights, and it's also the thing that's a little bit not my thing right now. But like that's kind of how he does it, is like, and then they'll do the artsy arena tour where they sort of do, and again, like, what do you do when you're fucking this far into a career where you've already done everything there is to do? And then you sort of do it again like 360, and then it's like, well, what do we do from here? Well, let's go into arenas and then put this amazing sort of theater spectacle together, you know, and like that tour didn't even sell out at that point, right? Like where the Joshua Tree Redux tour was gone in 5 minutes and it was in stadiums, they were doing arenas and they weren't selling out arenas because it was all new music. It's such a strange, the thing I can't profess to know is A, what they're thinking, or B, what it's like to be them. Like, so I just, I just hang on for the ride of being like, all right, I'll go see this one. And I go and see it and I'm like, oh man, that version of Unforgettable Fire sucked. And then I'll be like, but boy, that version of, you know, Mothers of the Disappeared blew my mind. Like that's what I can only kind of live in the moment of that experience. But they definitely make choices where I'm like, well, that wouldn't be the choice I make, but like, I'm fucking Matt Nathanson in my house, you know, walking down the street to my studio where it's like I make records for X amount of dollars. They're U2. I mean, you know what I mean? So I don't know what it's like, but yeah, it's the same thing, Elysa. Like, I don't think it's like they are fine. It's not a money thing. It's not, there's never pressure. It's all internal, and it's like, and they're dealing with their own things and getting old in a market that moves so fast and changes so rapidly that it's impossible. Like, it is impossible to stay in the focus. And Bono, for a long time, so badly wanted that, you know. Why else would you do a record with him? He's done some wild moves where you're like, what did they do? Like writing a song about Joey Ramone where Ryan Tedder from One Republic produces it. Like, nothing says Joey Ramone quite like One Republic to me. You know what I mean? It's that kind of thing where it's like, what the fuck are you doing? But like, it doesn't matter because like we're really fans and we're here to ride the ride. You know what I mean? It's like, let's do this, you know, but it is baffling sometimes, but I don't know. Rich.
And I think also, if I could just add really quickly, that they've, as performers, certainly they've aged with considerable grace. I mean, if you look at a band like the Stones, who, you know, for me, they're basically the same old teenage gang, and it's a little unseemly for me, but they were never my band. You know, with the fact that Bono and the rest of the guys in the band are sort of trying to do new things with presentation and just, you know, not just acting like, you know, oh, we're these old rock guys, you know, which you don't either, Matt. You know, I mean, there is a certain model of, you know, there's this baby boomer model of rock band that I think of the Stones as one band that's the band that most obviously has embodies that for me anyway. That's subjective.
Yeah, you know? and I don't want to. There's an aspect of U2. Again, there's a certain part, like Bono, again, to taking it on the face, like that guy's really aging in this period in his life. Like he's really starting to begin to sort of like falling off a bike, you know, hitting people on bikes and all this sort of illnesses and things that have happened to him. And so it's like the next thing for me, like as a fan, and I don't know where anybody else stands on this, but I would love for them to abandon like the we're a rock band thing. Like I would love for them to like stop leaning so hard into like rock and roll. And it's like, enough with the fucking rock and roll. Do you know what I mean? Like just be you, like whatever you is. And there's an aspect to it where, and it's funny when you watch the movie with Jack White and Jimmy Page, and like The Edge is amazing, and in that scene, and it brings me to tears every time I see it. But if you watch that movie, nothing says rock and roll less than The Edge in that fucking group of people. It's like Jimmy Page, Jack White, and The Edge, two of the most rock and roll motherfuckers on the planet. Like literally, Jimmy Page starts playing Whole Lotta Love, and if you don't shit yourself, you're dead. And it's like, and The Edge is like. And The Edge is transcendent, like he's changed guitar. But like rock and roll is not the description you would use to describe The Edge in that situation. So I don't know why Bono keeps leaning into that narrative so hard. I just want them to be fucking four Irish dudes who are getting old and maybe sometimes don't have taste and sometimes do. And U2, and oh God, like U2 so much about their people that they align themselves with. It's such an important part of what makes U2 great. And then I'll stop talking forever. What's so important is when they align themselves with the right conspirators, they get things out of the experience that are so far beyond. I hate teamwork. I don't do it well. Watching them coexist and do teamwork creatively has been one of the most inspiring things ever. And these days, and I think one of the missteps of Guy Osiri or Bono or whatever, is this idea that they keep picking the wrong collaborators to do things with. So it's like the result is it's not nearly what I want it to be, but it's what they want it to be. So they should be psyched, and it's awesome. And like, doesn't mean that the records aren't good. It's just like, I want them so badly to like have an emotional resurgence. But this is sort of,
Yeah.
I'll stop talking.
No, it's okay. I wish we could keep going. I want to thank my two panelists. This has been a great discussion. I wish we could continue on. Let's do this again,
Me too.
please.
Yeah, you guys are
Elysa
both great. Thank you. Thank you so
Elysa
much.
Gardner, good luck with your book.
Thank you.
And I would love to speak with you again in the future about Mephisto and theater and Spider-Man. And Matt Nathanson. Matt has a new record out, Achtung Baby, and he also has 2 concerts coming up, live stream concerts. You can find all of that at mattnathanson.com. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining this session. I appreciate you all being here. And